these kinds of ridiculous assertions that he can end the war in 24 hours or freeze it somehow assumes that Ukraine will just go along with it, or that Eastern European countries who are not confused about the threat that is Russia, that they'll just go along with it. I doubt that's the case.
Yesterday, we heard the news that the Biden administration was going to authorize long-range ATACMS strikes according to the reports, in Kursk Oblast. What do you think the significance of the timing and also where Ukraine is being allowed to use these weapons is?
So I'm not sure why this finally happened. Obviously, this is something that should have happened 2 years ago. I'm glad it did happen, but I'm not sure what finally caused it to break free. I am still frustrated that it's not a complete lifting of restrictions, that it still applies only to use against Russian and North Korean forces that are attacking the Kursk bridgehead. So better than nothing, but still falls short of what's actually needed.
A lot of people have pointed out that this probably won't be a game changer, but what will Ukraine be able to do now that it wasn't able to do before?
Well, I have to say I've never liked the phrase game changer, because the only thing that would really be a game changer would be if the Biden administration and other European governments would say that we want Ukraine to actually win this war, and that we would then commit to that. That would be the game changer. New weapons or authorities by themselves are not game changing. Nonetheless, this is still a positive step. I would anticipate that the Ukrainian General Staff will use these to target Russian headquarters, logistics, and artillery. Now, that's how you defeat mass, and mass is the only advantage that the Russian forces have, the big numbers. And so if you can destroy the headquarters that are necessary to coordinate their movements and their support, if you can destroy the artillery that enables their attacks, and if you can destroy the logistics that provides the artillery ammunition, then I think you can really degrade the effectiveness of Russian these mass attacks. That's what I expect the General Staff will do.
The election of Donald Trump, there's sort of a deadline now on the war, January the 20th when he takes office. If Trump follows through, he said he's going to freeze the conflict. Do you think there's the timing of the decision for ATACMS has that in mind?
Well, certainly the Biden administration would have been very conscious of the fact that the inauguration is only 2 months away, and that possibly influenced the thinking somehow. I'm not sure, but as I reflected on this all day yesterday, this is actually a gift from the Biden administration to the Trump administration to have this policy in place, so that then the Trump administration can just leave it or use it as a point of increased leverage against the Russians, or not. I mean, of course, I don't know what the Trump administration is going to do based on everything they've said during the campaign. I'm not hopeful that they're going to be supportive of Ukraine, but I am hopeful that the leadership of the Republican Party in the Congress, both in the Senate and in the House, are who mostly are pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO, pro-transatlantic, will be able to convey to the new administration how important it is that the United States not turn its back on Ukraine. We'll see if they have the ability to and the courage to push back against Trump designs to, end the war in 24 hours. And of course, these kinds of ridiculous assertions that he can end the war in 24 hours or freeze it somehow assumes that Ukraine will just go along with it, or that Eastern European countries who are not confused about the threat that is Russia, that they'll just go along with it. I doubt that's the case, because most of them know that they will end up paying the price if this conflict is frozen, because none of them believe for a second that Putin would ever live up to any agreement. So I'm I think once the Trump administration is in place and they're faced with the reality of owning the situation and the implications, and hopefully European leaders will convey to the Trump administration how important it is that Ukraine not be allowed to fail and that Russia not be allowed to keep everything that it has taken so far, then perhaps that will moderate some of the language that comes from the incoming administration.
And how important is it that Ukraine retains some territory in Kursk Oblast by the time that Trump comes into office? Because if Trump does try to impose a freeze of the front lines, obviously Ukrainian troops on Russian soil is greatly complicates things for the Kremlin.
I think this was one of the reasons I have been a supporter of the Ukrainian decision to launch the Kursk counteroffensive, is because it does create a real problem for the Kremlin, both in terms of whether or not to commit forces to try and eliminate this bridgehead, or in terms of if there is some sort of negotiation coming up that Ukraine occupies a chunk of Russian territory. So it does create a problem, and I think this was a brilliant move by Ukrainian General Staff. Now, at the end of the day, the Ukrainian General Staff will have to decide: is it worth it? Are they getting the benefit of this versus the casualties and the costs of hanging on to it? We'll see. They will know much better than I ever will. But again, Trump cannot impose a freeze on this conflict. The Americans, there's no American soldiers there. Europe is providing more aid together than is the United States. So I think the idea that somehow Trump can impose a freeze or impose a ceasefire that's just not what's actually going to happen. He can, of course, demand it. He can, of course, stop all aid. But I think that people with cooler heads will understand that it is to the advantage of the United States. It's in our interest that Europe remains stable and secure and prosperous for our own economic reasons, and that China is watching to see how we handle this. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done yet. So I'm not so certain that he's just going to cut it off.
What sort of leverage will Trump have over Putin to try to get him to stop? Because obviously in Donbass, the Russian offensive there is still relatively slow, but it's gaining pace. So Putin must think he has the upper hand. Well, does have the upper hand there. So what kind of thing can Trump do to try and force Putin into a deal?
Well, I mean, there's so many things that we have not done yet. We have not imposed all the sanctions that could have been imposed. We have not taken the steps to block Russia from exporting oil and gas to China and India, which is what generates the money necessary for Russia to be able to buy ammunition and weapons from Iran and North Korea. We've done nothing against those things. So there are still economic tools remaining to the incoming administration. And of course, he could say, I'm going to accelerate delivery of ATACMS, for example, or other capabilities. So the incoming president has a lot of leverage to build on what the Biden administration has already done, which has fallen well short of what I think could have been done. So Trump will have a lot of leverage against Putin. Does he want to use that? That's what remains to be seen.
You mentioned China just before. What do you think China is hoping happens when Trump takes office?
Well, I think that the Chinese are waiting to see, does the United States, do the U.S. and our allies have the political will to actually defend these post-war constructs of respect for sovereignty, freedom of navigation, respect for international law, respect for international agreements. If we're not willing to do that in Europe, they may think we're not willing to do that out in the Indo-Pacific region, where frankly it will be much more difficult to do. I mean, it takes 9 days for a U.S. Navy ship to go all the way from Hawaii to Japan, for example. So this is very, very difficult to enforce freedom of navigation in this kind of a geographical context. So I think the Chinese are going to be watching that. They'll be watching, will Trump follow through on the threat to impose these massive tariffs that will have a significant impact? I think, like everyone, they want to know how much is said in the campaign, how much of it's actually going to happen in reality.
And earlier on, you alluded to the differences in how particularly Eastern European states perceive the Russian threat and how America perceives the Russian threat. How do you think that's going to play out with an increasingly isolationist America? Is Europe going to be able to fill that gap if aid slows or if they reduce support in other ways?
No, they certainly can. I mean, the combined economies of the European Union, forget Canada and UK, the combined economies of the European Union are about 8 times greater than Russia. So this is about political will. It's not about economic capacity or industrial capacity. It's about political will. And so what I would hope is that Europe, really led by a new German government coming in February, probably led by Friedrich Merz and the CDU, Poland under Donald Tusk, and Finland under Alex Stubb, and Italy under Prime Minister Meloni, that together they could convince the American president, hey, don't turn your back on Europe. We still need an American nuclear deterrent, but we, Europe, can pick up the slack if the U.S. needs to back away from its support for Ukraine. There's a lot of potential in Europe. The question is, do they have the political will?
And just to finish with, how do you personally feel about the future for Ukraine?
I've always believed in the eventual victory of Ukraine, not because I want it to be so, but because I have seen what Ukraine has been able to accomplish over the last 11 years, that they have stopped Russia without consistent, decisive aid from the U.S. or from Europe. I mean, this war started in 2014, so all the people talking about, oh, today is the 1,000 days, that's only 1,000 days since the large-scale invasion. It's been almost 7,000 days since Russia first invaded Ukraine. And after 11 years, almost 7,000 days, Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine, and they have suffered devastating losses. Their Russian industry is in tatters. And so I think it's clear to me, I should say, that there's no way that Russia can just knock Ukraine out of the war unless we in the West quit. So this sort of resilience and determination by Ukrainian soldiers and people, emergency services, is something that we're all going to be studying and admiring for a very long time.
Thanks for watching. We can only produce great interviews like this and keep our website paywall free with your support. So please do consider becoming a member and signing up at KyivIndependent.com/membership.